This is Steve Hensel. I'm with Landshore and I'll be your host for today's webinar. First, I want to thank everyone who joined us for the first 3 webinars. In these webinars, we've gone from learning how to pick a process to automate, how to prioritize which processes you automate, and then how to build a business case for process automation that gets approved. Whether you have 1 automation or 15 automations, today's webinar helps you understand how to scale. Scaling is where you realize the ongoing return on the investment you have made, but it's also where historically a large percentage of all size companies run into some hurdles. One way to overcome this hurdle is to build out a center of excellence. Today's panel, whom I'll introduce shortly, was chosen to help you understand 3 different perspectives on why a COE is important and how to approach this phase. Before I introduce our speakers, I wanted to go over a few housekeeping details. Everyone has been muted. We do welcome and want your questions. To ask a question, please click on the chat icon in the lower right corner of your screen and type your question. We'll try to get all your questions answered by today's panel. If we don't, we'll answer them and distribute the questions and answers following this session. We'll provide you with a recording as well as slides from today. In addition, anyone who is attending can receive our value quantification tool that's in an easy-to-use spreadsheet format. I highly encourage you to use it as it will be critical to building a sustainable automation effort. I think it's important to provide you with the why and the what up front. Why is this important and what will it do for you? As I mentioned in our last session, the why is automation is increasing rapidly as every business undergoes some type of digital transformation effort. Forrester has stated that businesses that are pursuing an automation strategy are seeing an 86% increase in efficiency, 67% improvement in insights into their customers. They're able to provide a 57% improved customer experience. Unfortunately, 50% of the deployments fail to scale according to Deloitte, and Ernst & Young said 30 to 50% fail after their initial try. So the why is we want you to be successful, and we have the right resources on today's panel to give you real-world experience. The what is we're going to give you the right tools and access to subject matter experts to help you build a sustainable, scalable automation engine. Our format this morning is a panel discussion. We've chosen these panelists because of their perspectives and the experience they bring. Raun Kilgo, CIO of Advantage Point Solution, understands the underlying process improvement models and how to apply robotic or intelligent automation to drive results. Mark Warren, CFO Landshore, brings the perspective of leveraging automation to help Landshore grow, as well as helping you understand the financial impact of investing in automation technology. We have a special guest today, Phillip Clay. Phillip is head of UiPath's Emerging Products Group. He's in a unique position of working with customers and partners as they build out their automation initiatives, and he's a great resource to help you see the art of the possible. You know, what I find extraordinary and exciting is that if we had had this webinar at the beginning of last year's pandemic, we would have focused on the process and the structure around scaling your automation and building out a center of excellence, which is still a core component. But now we're seeing a shift in the business world. There's a growing trend where valued workers are resigning and are looking for how they can make an impact both in business and life. For companies, that means the lever of compensation is not as effective as it once was, and they have to address what is being called the future of work. Because the COE often sits in the business versus IT, it is uniquely positioned to help enable workers to make meaningful changes to how they do their job. I'm going to ask Raun to briefly recap lessons from the first webinars, but then I'll ask our panelists to discuss their opinions from a process point of view, from a financial point of view, and from a solution point of view, how automation and building out a COE can address a very real challenge. How does it engage the employee to make their work more meaningful? So Raun, for those who are joining for the first time, can you level set what we've talked about so far?
Sure, thanks. So we're following roughly a DMAIC cycle here for any of you process professionals. We've talked about how you define what you want to do for the first iteration, begin to gather some measurements around the current state activity and analyze how you might want to improve it. Today we're going to be focusing on the improve and the control cycles. And the control cycle, of course, is heavily data driven. And that's why we're very pleased to have Phillip Clay here with us to talk about some of the opportunities in that area. So we're just going to briefly touch on improve and control and really wrap this around the things that you might want to consider with your center of excellence. I will point out the obvious here. This is a cycle. You should assume that this is a continuous improvement cycle. Rarely, if ever, does somebody do a boil the ocean type project and get all the value they need. It's important to iterate fast with this kind of technology and allow it to keep up with the changes within the business and the IT environment. So on the improve side, once again, part of the recap, you're going to find the low-hanging fruit, so to speak. I know that's often overused, by focusing on the things that are on the right-hand side of this chart, the algorithmic activity that your workers are performing today. Generally speaking, algorithmic activity is more appropriately done by a computer. They do it better, they do it faster. But sometimes there's things that are ill-defined or some harder, heavy lifting things that aren't appropriate for computers. You want your workers involved with that type of activity. And that's the heuristic activity that we've shown on the left. Now, as we talk about this kind of work and what you want to improve, just want to level set on a hierarchy of process actions. You're going to hear us talk about tasks. These are the individual things that are almost inseparable that you do on a daily basis. They can be part of an overall process that has value add to your business, or they could be an administrative process. So tasks in general, that's the step activity. If you were to look at a training document or a standard of procedure, you may see the individual task shown as a step in that document. Those tasks roll up to an activity, and often you understand an activity based on the departments that that function is done in. And so a bucket of tasks, those tasks may have commonality across the entire operation, but done in a certain order and in a certain fashion. That's an activity within a department. And then the process is generally the end-to-end activity, set of activities within an organization. So just to give you an example, if you had a lending operation, a banking operation in your lending department, you may have the process of lending. Activities that build up to that are loan origination, loan underwriting, loan closing, and then the various tasks, which may not have a one-to-one correlation to those activities, is the various onboarding activities that you would need to do, the know your customer activities that you have to go through when you start a relationship with a new customer, taking the loan application itself, pulling the credit report, confirming the income. So processes are the highest level of extrapolation, and then the individual tasks are kind of the most granular. Often when you think about this, in the first iteration, you get many of your automation ideas from the workers themselves, because there's a reason that a company like UiPath or Landshore or APS comes into play here. There's been a recognition within the needed. There may be some certain points of pain, and you're going to get a lot of the information that you need to define that initial automation from your employees. You can also use a variety of task mining tools. UiPath's task mining tool is excellent. So then you can go on to the higher level kind of thought processes where these tasks are put together in an overall process using some machine learning and artificial intelligence technologies. But I guess the first thing I'll direct to is Phillip. Phillip, when you think about task mining and even the crowdsourcing stuff, where do you find that your customers have the highest value in that first iteration? Is there a pattern that you've seen?
Yeah, well, first off, thank you. I'm super excited to be here and having this chat today. When it comes to task mining specifically, there are a few patterns. For one, we like to look at end users who use multiple different products and applications. So for example, task mining isn't super insightful if it just uses one product to do one thing. That's where task capture or documentation would come more into play. But task mining within itself, when you're jumping in and out of applications and you're doing complex activities where we can extrapolate patterns using our machine learning and our artificial intelligence, those are the best use cases. We also like to look at different personas. So, we have different task workers or people within different groups of the business, and they have very specific roles that have been identified maybe from a business process standpoint, but doesn't mean they've necessarily been evaluated for effectiveness. And so we like to break them out and look at different personas within each of those groups and kind of get a bigger sample size to collect that data. I would say for the automation crowdsourcing idea, it's like kind of democratization of automation. Those usually come from really creative, imaginative people who are looking to solve problems, but they're not empirical. So they tend not to have quantifiable results behind them. They are, kind of ideas or personalized ideas. And so those are great to start the conversation, but then we would push those to more of the analytical, empirical side, which is the task mining. So hopefully that gives you some insight into kind of those patterns.
Excellent. So in the task mining activity, I understand how that might inform that first iteration of automation. But once you've got that first release in production and you're watching it, how do these tools come into play with maybe a control phase where you're trying to make sure everything continues to move forward and you're beginning to define your next iteration?
Yeah, so it aligns really kind of with your continuous loop. The first thing you should actually document, or at least quickly jot down, is how you think it should be. It is nice to start with a theory, kind of a hypothesis or what good looks like. And that's sort of the happy path, so we'll call that something that looks good. Then you would run a baseline. So now we run task mining. We run a couple sprints on these personas I mentioned. We start documenting and visualizing what is actually happening. And then you have to sort of review and look at what you thought it should be versus what is happening. And there is some sort of kind of happy medium there. From there, it's not too hard to come up with what's called a baseline or that control that we talk about. That is what we need to either work towards, or if you get that lucky chance that the persona matched up with what you want and it is the right way to go, now you have a true target, kind of where you're at, where you want to go. Then from there, now you start identifying and implementing changes, methodologies, and other adjustments. Once you get those in place, you go back and you run the analysis again, and then you start looking at it, and you can see, based on the baseline and where you want to go, the progress you're making. And we don't really identify a true best practice from our point of view. I know Landshore has tons of this, a lot of intellectual properties and experience doing this, but you could do it every couple quarters, you could do it every month, you could see the progress over time if you want to map it that way. It really does depend on the circumstance and the customer.
The baselining that you talk about is so critical. Often when I'm engaged in these projects, just establishing before we do anything what the true baseline is today. is often difficult and lends itself well to some of the tools that UiPath has for that type of activity. But after the improvement is in place, I think you nailed it. Getting the new state, or the what was while the project was going on, the future state, but the new state or the current state baseline readjusted, that's also critical. And I know a lot of people use the tools and they'll dip in and get kind of a sampling of what the current state is. I actually think there's value in basically at least a subset of the activity, monitoring it continually so that you understand how things ebb and flow within your environment, and understand where there may be some things that you're not going to pick up on sampling. So baselining, I think that's a great point. It's critical to your success here. Now, just briefly, when people start attacking this type of automation, they often will start to get a little bit confused as you get into it. And this is why I often coach people. You need to be very clear on what, in your documentation or in your discussions, what is your current state and what is your desired future state. And don't mix those in the same documents. But the other thing that's very helpful is if you make sure that you view things through these three architectural tiers. You have your user interface, that's how your workers are actually going to engage with the technology. You have your business rules, and you have the data. Now, RPA excels at getting at data that other technologies can't get at. And it can consume APIs and do database calls and everything like that, but it can also do that stuff that you have humans performing today, because in the past that was the only way you could get at that information. One of the biggest mistakes I see companies make is they start to put those ephemeral business rules into the solution itself. I think it's critical that you take every effort you can to extract the stuff that changes often and ephemeral from the automation flow, not out of the automation, but take it out of the automation flow so that you can make those adjustments, a credit limit adjustment or whatever. Now, thinking about that, I don't know if Phillip or Mark, you have any thoughts on this area, but I think it's important just to make sure you understand with your automation where you're getting the value and how that's going to eventuate in the solution itself. Now, to give that feedback, yeah, go ahead. Sorry.
I was going to defer to Mark, but we could definitely talk about it, Raun, because I mean I think you make a great point. Systems are not fixed, right? If we look at most environments, it's fair to say they're dynamic. And I think what ends up happening is when you explore, you take a snapshot of point in time, then there's lag as you evaluate, test, quality control, implement, and maintain. The issue is by the time you get to that phase, you're stepping in, the river analogy, you never step into the same spot twice. It's gone. It's shipped. It's different. And now you're trying to fix it as you roll it out and try to make it, adjust for change. Separating those rule sets from the automation so that you can make, push buttons, pull levers is a lot more effective than trying to rehaul the entire technology from the ground up every time you want to make a significant change. So you'll start to hear from us a lot at UiPath a lot about no code and low code rapid adjustments, and so that fits right to that kind of rule set that you mentioned.
Well, exactly right.
I was going to say, I think this feeds into the next slide, but I'll let you go in a minute here, Raun. But just
go ahead.
The whole concept of the center of excellence and having a centralized place that once we get those processes initially scoped out, designed, tested, and deployed, we have the center of excellence. We have a central place for the automations we're doing. And that's just a key consideration that, yeah, we built those processes out as automations, but then we go through a process of centralizing the maintenance of support of those processes, because processes over time can change slightly because, you know, we're dealing with various applications, and those applications get upgraded or changed, or something in the process changes slightly, or a piece of information is unexpected in terms of what comes through, and it causes the process to sort of it pauses, or needs to be revisited. So one of the key considerations and the recommendations that we have is that whenever you're doing this sort of work, you need to put in a center of excellence. So a COE has to be put in place, and it's more important that you get something in as a COE and get that started than having say, well, I'm going to build a perfect COE. I'm going to have it all ready to go, and then don't even put that in place because you're more worried about, oh, it's got to be excellent. It's got to be perfect. You know, there is the political and operational relationships between IT, the RPA team, the people doing the actual design and development, and then the business. So there's three different stakeholder groups, if you will. And I think, unlike traditional IT projects, it's really important to get the business involved. You know, if you get buy-in, get them involved, and if possible, have the COE managed by team members out of the business rather than IT. Because what I think we find is that IT folks will sometimes look at this as primarily, what IT applications can I put in place, whereas the RPA application allows us to use the existing IT applications and things we're doing, and try to create efficiencies, as opposed to changing the IT applications or customizing those. It's looking at the tools that we have around RPA and utilizing those.
Doesn't that kind of also fit into the comment I made at the beginning, which is work is changing. People want to have a bigger say-so in the work they do to make it more meaningful. So if you're, and nothing against IT, they still play a very critical role, but when you do place it in IT, there's a lot of governance and security and things around there that still come into play in the COE, but putting it into the business, Phillip, what do you see that enables customers to do, and how fast can they move versus the alternative?
So if you look at most organizations, IT, you know, IT acts as a vendor supplier, you know, internally. So they get requirements or business requirements. You put in a rec request, you tell them what to build or buy or test, and then they deliver that. The issue is translation and getting that done. If you leave it in IT, very little or rare, it's a very rare thing where they come up with, you know, paradigm shifting transformations from the bottom up. You know, if IT promotes a business idea, it's not really taken as serious in most organizations because it came from a different group. So that's the first thing. It's just the genesis of the change in ideas coming from IT can be challenging culturally. The second thing is a COE being out of IT and it's come from a business. You get better agency from the stakeholders because they can see both cross-functionally how their business unit's being impacted and what processes are being held up. And you can also build a coalition of these stakeholders to work together in a more seamless manner before they hand it off to IT or equivalent. And I think the other way to look at it too, and I don't want to pick on IT because that's actually kind of my background, but IT is just one component of a successful COE, right? And so you need finance, you need legal, you need compliance, you need governance, you need systems, you need people. And because it touches all of those, to have a strong COE, you really shouldn't confine it into one group like that because that's just one part. So I look at it from that angle as you explore. The last thing I would say with COEs too, and I think you made a great point. Any COE is better than none, or a okay COE is way better than waiting for a great COE. The thing with the Center of Excellence too is that they change a lot, and this is a dynamic world we live in too with this whole segment of our technology. And so you may have an idea what your COE will look like. You'll even have all the people identified and what their roles and responsibilities are, and make RACI charts and define matrices and get it all done. But then you'll find that maybe not as impactful in the business. So now you have to change it. So my only unsolicited advice on this panel would be when you look at your COE, don't romanticize how it's going to be and be in your business. Be open-minded. Have the flexibility to know that maybe the first iteration of your COE is going to change and it's going to evolve, and you have to make some rapid adjustments to meet certain kind of changing parameters within the business. So that's what I would add on that side.
So before we move on into Mark talking a little bit about the best practices, let me ask you this. When I first started becoming aware of UiPath, it was an RPA. It was robotic process automation. When I look at you 4 or 5 years future or today, it's changed quite a bit, and you're looking at future products. It seems to me the way you're building out your approach and platform is you're looking at technologies that are enabling work to happen. And it's whether you call it the iPhone from Apple or that approach, it's much more user centric and business friendly than historically tools have been. Can you comment on that? Because it does play into having a successful COE and reaching out to those business constituents.
Yeah, from my perspective, and I kind of speak from my lens and my point of view, but it's still fascinating to me to see how complex the business world is. It is surprising to me how companies get things done, considering the layers of just unneeded bureaucratic processes, legacy policies that aren't relevant, technical and methodology debt that nobody wants to evaluate, knowledge issues and constraints. I mean, and this is like 1 inch deep of a very complex environment. And we're seeing a lot of things over the last few years where employees just don't want to deal with that. It impacts their quality of life at work. It impacts their ability to get things done. It's deflating. It removes agency, which psychologists have agreed that's probably the number one thing employees need to feel empowered at work. It's just a really challenging, and if you look at the most valuable assets on most companies' books, it's their payroll, it's their people, it's what drives innovation and change. And so, you're seeing our product shift not only to automate away inefficiencies, but also make the end user experience way better, or at least reallocate their efforts to things that could drive net gain versus defense. We talk a lot about a scarcity mindset versus an abundance mindset about kind of our solutions. And most companies come from a scarcity. We got to protect and defend and limit our spending and all that stuff. And that is one approach as a steward of the business. But there's also a net growth. Like, how do I make the pie bigger? How do I give employees who could not get to certain initiatives or projects the ability to grow and focus that? And we have a lot of stories where people were repurposed to work on projects that they couldn't get to, and it actually was the next big technology investment the company did or new product they released for their customers. So that's where you're going to see our focus. That means giving every end user an assistant to automate his task away. It means giving the end users the ability to develop applications. I use that word, kind of in air quotes, to develop applications for their own personal use to solve problems versus going to the development team or IT or whoever used to be kind of the bottleneck, they could actually put together an application, if you will, to solve their problems. So you're going to see our products become more and more enhanced in that way and more powerful for the average non-technical business user to develop and deploy solutions for their environment. So sorry, that's a long-winded answer, but it's a big trend we're seeing.
I think it's great. Now, of course, we set Mark up, put him in a difficult position because the COE does bring structure into that process. So Mark, and the clients that Landshore and Raun, the clients that APS works with, how do you blend the structure with the innovation that's going on today?
I think the key for us is that we kind of come up with this like a systematic approach. I mean, nothing's perfect, and we have to sort of roll with things. But we were talking previously about tasks feeding up to activities, which feed up to the processes. Yes, when you start with a new client, you may have 5 processes or 6 processes that you want to implement, and then you create a COE. It's not completely at the end. You're developing and getting prepared for that all the way through. So again, from this diagram, we kind of show that as you're doing discovery, you're defining the tasks, the activities, and the processes. Information there becomes available to the future COE. As you design, you document, and if you're depending on the RPA application you use, if it requires some written documentation or some, because if you're using a task mining product, or some products have all that together, but in other cases, depending on what RPA tool you're using, you may actually have to put pen to paper and write a document, and then you move on to build. So each one of these steps gives us more information and more artifacts that we can make part of a COE. And like when we get to testing, we can see that, oh, something didn't work. So, or there's a problem in these steps that we documented. So we make updates. And then finally, when you get to production, you should have a good set of information for the COE to run with say the 4, 5, 6 processes you started with. And then you're into a maintenance and support model where if something breaks or something changes, there's up and down flow in terms of the COE being able to make changes. Again, this looks at it and says, it's very linear, but the reality of it's iterative, because I start with a handful of processes and I add processes, and each time we build a new process, we recover these steps and it feeds into the COE. So again, I guess it's just the whole concept that we've talked about, things being iterative. They become iterative as we add more processes or the processes change.
But your point about the COE being iterative is excellent. And a couple of the ways I describe it to people is, often it's hard to build a COE if nobody in the COE has actually been through one of these cycles. It's learning in a vacuum. So you almost need to get in there and get your hands dirty, so to speak, before you understand the proper role of the COE. One of the unstated roles of the COE that I see in a well-functioning COE everywhere is to be the air traffic controllers of the people that are actually doing the work. If you're in the middle of a project, you don't necessarily know that the sales team has decided they're going to move to a totally different sales comp platform in 3 months. And that's where you need somebody that's in the business, that understands what's down the road, basically saying, hey, we may want to do this thing here differently so that we can transition it. Not saying don't do it, but we can transition it in the future. The other thing is, I find that the most successful projects, and I'm talking about individual projects, not an iterative program, have no longer than a calendar quarter from the discovery phase to the deployment to production. If you're defining a set of automations that you want to get into production, and the production release date is more than 3 months out, you're probably doing too much. And by that, I mean, there's going to be so many change events within that environment that you're not going to be able to keep up with it. And it's better just like the COE. A COE is better than the perfect COE. Any COE is better than the perfect one. It's almost any automation in production is better than the automation that's going to be perfect, 1 year down the road. The other thing I'd like to add on to with some of the stuff that Phillip was talking about, just give you a use case example. We did a set of automations for a finance group for a major telecom recently. And one of the things that a lot of people kind of knee-jerk when they hear automation, they think, oh, you're going to replace all the people. And that's almost never the case. But this particular group had some tax accountants that we did a series of automation for these tax accountants that were handling federal and state tax returns and tax audits. And the VP of this group basically said, the thing I like most about these automations is, up to now, I've been playing defense against these auditors. Now I've got things in place, and as soon as I get a notice, or even before I get a notice, I have automations putting things together. We are now on offense in this tax arena, and we know exactly what we need to do to address this. We're never behind the 8 ball, whereas before we were always playing catch up. So putting your team on offense kind of illustrates the point Phillip was making about repurposing those people for higher value and for that growth thinking, not that scarcity thinking. So great points, Mark and Phillip, both. Any other thoughts on the COE before we move on to the control phase?
I'll just add one more thing that does come up, and it's not advertised as much, but you kind of sparked this. And that's when a business is over constrained and there's no slack and there's no ability to reflect and actually plan for things tend to get rolled out a little hastily, right? Without review or to look at the impact and what it really means to the business. A well-operating COE can actually catch some of those before damage is done, after the fact. And a prime example is you roll out, you mentioned, a new finance or a new payroll comp model or something along those lines. But if you roll it out and you did it in your own silo and you kind of did it ad hoc, nobody else functionally would see it. With a well-oiled COE, when you get to the discovery and design phase and you go to hit publish, after you'll see, well, there's some connections here. There's actually going to be an impact. It's actually going to ripple through, and we can see it because we've mapped out a really clean automation model, and it actually breaks it. And now you can address those before they go into production. So just kind of an unpublished, we don't advertise that much, but it is a positive side effect of a COE in place.
Absolutely. So as we get into the control phase, this is the final phase of a DMAIC cycle, but it's also the introduction of the next iteration. So Phillip, I know that UiPath has some great tools in this capacity. I've already articulated the fact that I like to use these tools for continuous monitoring so that I know when things go out of a control state from my previous iterations, but can also start pointing to the next round without having to depend on somebody doing a sampling. The problem with the sampling, of course, is you tell everybody you're about to do a sampling and maybe you don't get reality when you're doing the sampling. If you're doing it in a continuous fashion, then you have some of that Hawthorne effect weeded out of the activity. So talk to us about how these tools can be used in a control phase and how they point to the next iteration.
Yeah, so there's a bunch of things here, and this is where I get the most excited because this stuff is definitely game changing from our point of view. So let's talk about the control just in general. And like you said, yeah, you want to discover in the wild real world scenarios and issues so you can either adjust, fix, reevaluate, all of that stuff. The other side effect of a strong control model is that you can actually showcase to the leaders, the people that own the budgets and approve these finances and capital projects. Hey, guess what? We can actually show you what it looked like before and what it's doing and the impact in the future. And this has been a very, I'm going to use the word massive success for a lot of stakeholders, because they come in and instead of being inspected on each of these, they're actually getting approval and they can show milestones of success with hard data from these tools that show, okay, yes, if we continue to make these type of investments, we're going to see these results. I would caution, as we talk about these tools for 2 seconds, that it's just starting. I mean, the technology, we're always on the edge of science fiction here a little bit because we're trying to push the boundaries. You know, what we're trying to do is really complicated than our slides show. We're trying to use modeling, analytics, machine learning, artificial intelligence, algorithms, really large compute cycles to find patterns and trace back to these issues. So I don't want to oversell where we're, what we've done so far, but I do want to paint the picture that this is a big bet for UiPath. This is where we see the future of helping clients discover and build automation environments. So right now the category is broken down into 4 primary products when it comes to control. We'll start from the top. So task mining we've talked about. That's individual, where we have nothing visible about the client and we want to see what they do. They run, so average time is about 2 weeks. We collect a bunch of data and we put together a post dashboard, and it shows you, hey, this is where you can find automation opportunities and this is where you can improve and stuff. And it's a great way to individually look at people. Now, when you look at processes, that's more system-wide. That's the event logs from these big ERP systems, these big supply chain, HR systems, whatever you want to classify as a process, and that can combine with task mining. So if you're doing process mining, you look at a giant finance system and you see that one person or several people are the outliers, they're the ones that are taking weeks to get invoices approved. You can run task mining on that group to define, like, okay, what is actually the root cause? Is it a coaching thing? Is it a process thing? Is it a technology thing? You can start evaluating that and making those adjustments to the control. Sometimes you get really lucky and you do a process mining and you find someone who is the role model for your organization and you want to replicate that across the group. This is where task capture comes in, or it can be you just know what you want. And this actually documents what people are doing in real time. I think it's a recorder, a really, really enhanced recorder, which will record you doing your thing. And then that can turn into both documentation and an automation script artifact that you can upload into Studio and publish. And then Automation Hub, this is actually foundationally where we kind of started. And it was this idea that it didn't come from IT or specialized consultants or system integrators. It could be the average person on the ground floor who has an idea and submits it, and then we run through that, and then we test it, and then we kind of go through the iterations and then get published. What's nice about all of these is that it's an input model, both from a scientific and an experience. And through those different things, you can validate what's going on. The last thing I'll say on control, and it's a little controversial, so I'll apologize in advance, but people have a perceived what they think is happening and what is actually happening, and they're not congruent most of the time. We would sit down with a customer and say, hey, well, tell us what you think is happening. We'll spend a lot of time interviewing and mapping it through, and they wholeheartedly believe that is what's going on. That's what they see. That's their perception. But the reality is not the case. We run through the science, we collect the data, we build this control model, and you look at it and they're way off. I mean, they don't line at all. And it's very eye-opening for a lot of organizations to go through. And, if Landshark comes in and presents this information, like, hey, we found a ton of deltas in between what you were documenting, what your run book said, what you're publishing internally for your employees to what was really happening. And so, there's just a lot of that's happening. And then I'll finalize on this. You do the iterations, like you said, that's when you kind of that's a heavy lift. We get everything kind of just to this newest control state. Then the follow-up iterations get easier because now you're not doing such a big change. It's now iterative. It's smaller tweaks to get maximum effectiveness. So that's the other thing with these tools. I love the continuous improvement because now you can make real-time decisions to impact the business until waiting until like critical, kind of critical failure.
And Phillip, you talk about the concept of the disconnect between what's actually happening and what maybe the management or even the team is telling you is happening is controversial. I find it's only controversial when there's no data to support whatever their thought process is, right? And then once they see the data, it's no longer controversial. But when you go in there and somebody says, oh, you don't understand, my team is like 95% utilized, and then you pull some stats and find out the true utilization rate is something like 45%, which is actually more common than you would think. It's not because they'll think that it's threatening to them because it makes them a bad manager. Well, no, you're not a bad manager. You only are as good as the tools and the processes that you have in place to manage your teams. Now, so I think it's a great point. I will point out that traditionally within the automation world, and that this is beginning to blur, but there were a set of automation technologies maybe 10 or 15 years ago that focused on doing stuff on a server without any humans engaged. And then there were some other companies, and I think UiPath has great assets on both sides, but there were other companies that focused on maybe doing stuff with a worker. And often these were called unified desktop companies. They weren't really called automation companies. The beauty of the control state and the control tools that UiPath has is often those rules are there and you might be able to take a segment of work and fully automate it. In other words, move it to an unattended process. But the activities and the rules aren't well documented. They're in people's heads. So you may have to start with something that you know could be fully automated, but initially you make it an attended automation. You allow those workers in the process of working to go to those intranet sites and to pull up the other applications that they do their job. While you're monitoring them, you can then see that algorithmic activity unfold, and gradually you can move that stuff to the unattended side. Now, from the human perspective, generally speaking, if you can take something off somebody's plate to allow them to focus on what the caller is saying or what their boss is asking them to get done, they're actually happier. So often when people tell me, well, that would be threatening if you tell them you're going to fully automate that activity, more often than not, the workers tell me, thank you for removing that, because now I'm not handcuffed to this desk doing this algorithmic activity. I can demonstrate to my boss that I understand the overall environment. And like the tax accountant was telling me, I can start playing offense on behalf of my company and my department. So you need to think about an attended automation as an opportunity to continue to surface rules that you may not know, document rules and processes that aren't necessarily documented well today, and then you can start doing more and more of those unattended automations, augmenting your current staff. So guys, this is, I'm going to throw the questions out to you guys first if there's anything else you want to build on, but this is our last content slide before we go to the questions from the group. Any final thoughts before we go to questions?
I think we've actually kind of bumped up against the time, Raun. So we'll answer the questions via email. But for the first time in a long time, I'm actually excited about the future of work. And that sounds strange, but we're finally reaching that pivot point where people are empowered to begin making their jobs work better and actually add value to their jobs and to their businesses. So certainly I appreciate all the knowledge and experience coming from Phillip and from Raun and from Mark. Hopefully you as our customers and potential customers can see that there's a lot of experience in this group. And if we can help you on your automation journey, then leverage us. Certainly we've kind of brought you the perfect triumvirate of technology, process, and experience. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and wrap it up. But Phillip, thank you. Raun, thank you. Mark, thank you. This has been a ball. We look forward to the feedback from our clients and from those of you who are listening to us. With that, thanks again, and see you down the road.